Hi, Mr. Loomis. We're going to continue with Unit 18, which is all about times when Americans have failed. Today we'll be looking at Lesson 2, about a series of scandals and mistakes that happened in the 1970s, and how they eroded our trust in our leaders. Let's begin by just previewing our topics. We'll talk about the Pentagon Papers and Watergate, which both relate to President Nixon. Then we'll move on to President Carter and the Iran hostage crisis. Finally, we'll tell the story, the 3 Mile Island nuclear power accident. We'll start with the story of the Pentagon Papers. In 1967, Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara asked a special group of writers to create an encyclopedic history of the Vietnam War. McNamara thought that would be a good history of what happened in Vietnam might help other presidents avoid the same mistakes. But McNamara did not tell anyone else about his project. Instead of using historians that already worked for the Defense Department, McNamara gave the job to his close friends. 36 people worked on the project. To keep their work a secret, they mostly used existing files in the office of the Secretary of Defense and did not do any interviews. The study was 3,000 pages long and was labeled Top Secret. But the report did not stay secret. One of the writers, Daniel Ellsberg, was against the war, and he and his friend Anthony Russo made copies of the study in October of 1969. They planned to give those copies to people in the news. Ellsberg thought that the report showed unconstitutional behavior by many presidents, as they had lied about what was happening in Vietnam. In February 1971, Ellsberg gave the New York Times reporter Neil Sheehan large numbers of his copies. The lawyers at the New York Times could not agree about printing the report. Some thought it was a bad idea, but in the end they decided that newspapers had a First Amendment right to print information that was important and would help people know what their government was doing. The New York Times began printing the documents on July 13, 1971, in a series titled Vietnam Archive, Pentagon Study Traces 3 Decades of Growing U.S. Involvement. Later, people called it the Pentagon Papers, for short. The Pentagon Papers showed that 4 presidents, Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy, and Johnson, had not told the truth about the war in Vietnam. When he learned about the report, President Nixon thought he did not need to do anything. The report made Kennedy and Johnson look bad, not him. But Henry Kissinger told the president that not trying to stop the New York Times from printing the Pentagon Papers might make other people think giving government secrets to newspapers was okay, and they might tell the newspapers something embarrassing about Nixon. Nixon's lawyers asked the New York Times to stop printing the papers, but the newspaper's leaders said no. Then the Attorney General and Nixon asked a judge to order the New York Times to stop printing. The newspaper appealed the case, and the case New York Times Company versus United States went up to the Supreme Court. Then the Washington Post, which had also gotten parts of the report from Ellsberg, started printing its own articles about the Pentagon Papers. Again, Nixon's lawyers tried to stop the newspapers in court. In the end, the Supreme Court decided to join the Washington Post case with the New York Times case. It was going to be an important fight between the press and the government about power and freedom. On July 30th, 1971, the Supreme Court decided 6-3 that Nixon and the government did not show that the country would be hurt if the newspapers printed the Pentagon Papers. The 9 justices each had their own ideas and reasons, but they all agreed on one basic idea. People in the news are important because they protect us from politicians who lie, and we need a free press to help keep us free from bad leaders. The case was a big win for newspapers and the media in general. Even today, the New York Times Company versus United States case protects the right of the press to report what government leaders are doing, even when those leaders don't want the public to know. In 2011, the National Archives and Record Administration made the Pentagon Papers public. Today, anyone can read the Pentagon Papers online. Let's move on to the presidential election of 1972. After their disorganized and violent meeting in Chicago in 1968, the Democratic Party changed the rules for its presidential candidate. The new rules gave delegates for each candidate based on how many votes a candidate got in each state primary election. This meant that a candidate who did not win any primaries would not be able to be the party's nominee, which Hubert Humphrey had done in Chicago. The new rules gave greater power to voters and took power away from party leaders. This change made America's government more democratic. That is, the people would have more control over who the president would be. George McGovern was against the Vietnam War. However, many Democrats did not support him. Working and middle-class voters turned against him after they found out that he might have supported abortion and making drug use legal. Also, people learned that McGovern's first choice for vice president, Thomas Eagleton, had once gotten electroshock treatment for depression. Eagleton quit, but the whole thing made McGovern look like he would make bad choices if he were president. Nixon and the Republicans were popular from the start. Nixon's actions, including his visit to China and a good economy, helped make him popular with voters. To make sure he won, Republicans tried to make McGovern look like a radical leftist who wanted to forgive people who tried to get out of the draft. In the election, McGovern only won Massachusetts and Washington, D.C. Nixon won every other state. It was one of the biggest victories in American history. Unfortunately for Nixon, his downfall had already begun. During the election, the Committee to Re-elect the President, CREEP, C-R-E-E-P, which raised money for Nixon, decided to play dirty tricks on the Democrats. For example, men were sent to spy on both McGovern and Senator Edward Kennedy. They pretended to work for the Democrats, called businesses to rent or buy things for rallies. Rallies were never held, of course, and Democratic politicians had to pay the bills. CREEP's most famous operation, however, was its break-in at the offices of the Democratic National Committee, DNC, at the Watergate office building in Washington, D.C. 5 men from CREEP were sent to break into the offices of the DNC, take pictures of documents, and wiretap telephones. The break-in went badly. The security guard found them, and they were arrested by the police. Breaking the law is always bad for a politician, but Nixon had not broken the law. He didn't even know what CREEP was planning. The problem for Nixon was his paranoia. Nixon always thought that his enemies were smarter than him, and that his friends might turn against him. The Watergate break-in was exactly the sort of problem Nixon was most scared of. When he found out about the problem, Nixon tried to hide it, so the Democrats would not be able to use it against him. In the weeks following the Watergate break-in, Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, young reporters at the Washington Post, started to find out what was going on. They got information from some people who asked that their names not be used, including one person the reporters only called Deep Throat. Bernstein and Woodward realized that people in the White House were trying to hide the crime. They began writing articles about what they'd learned. Woodward and Bernstein's articles led the Senate to create a special committee to look into the Watergate scandal. In the spring and the long, hot summer of 1973, Americans watched the Senate investigation on television. One by one, the people who worked for Nixon admitted or denied their role in the Watergate scandal. The top lawyer at the White House, John Dean, said that Nixon was involved in the conspiracy, but Nixon said he was not. In March 1974, the president's chief of staff, H.R. Haldeman, top aide John Ehrlichman, and John Mitchell, the leader of Nixon's re-election campaign, were charged with conspiracy in court. Nixon fired Haldeman, Ehrlichman, and Dean. Trying to show that he was innocent, he appointed a special prosecutor, Archibald Cox, to investigate what happened at Watergate. Without evidence clearly showing that Nixon had tried to hide the break-in, Nixon might have gotten away with it. But then, Alexander Butterfield, who worked at the White House, was asked if there were any recordings of Nixon. In fact, Butterfield had helped Nixon set up a recording system that would turn on whenever anyone in the Oval Office talked, or any time the president was on the phone. Nixon wanted the recordings for his own use and kept them secret because he thought people would act strange if they knew they were being taped. Cox in the Senate asked for the tapes, but Nixon said no. He said there were some things a president did not have to give to investigators. When he said he would give summaries of what was on the tape, Cox said no, and that Nixon had to give him the full recordings. On October 20th, 1973, in an event that we now call the Saturday Night Massacre, Nixon told Attorney General Richardson to fire Cox. Richardson said no and quit. So did Deputy Attorney General William Ruckschutz when Nixon told him to do what Richardson would not. That left Solicitor General Robert Bork in charge of the Justice Department, and he did what Nixon asked. The American people were angry about what Nixon had done. It seemed like the president thought he didn't have to follow the law. Angry letters started arriving at the White House from people who thought Nixon should quit. It was at this time that Nixon gave one of his most famous quotes. He was talking to news reporters, and he said, "I welcome this kind of examination because people have got to know whether or not their president is a crook. Well, I'm not a crook." It turned out he was a crook. When Nixon finally gave investigators the recordings in April of 1974, he gave only edited versions. In July, the Supreme Court ruled in United States versus Nixon that he had to hand over the full versions. The tape showed several key conversations between Nixon and his lawyer, John Dean. In the recordings, Dean called the Watergate investigation a cancer on the presidency. The men from CREEP that had been caught at the break-in were being paid not to talk, and Dean said that Nixon's top helpers were involved. In the end, Nixon himself gave orders on tape to pay off witnesses. It was now clear that Nixon himself had tried to hide the crime. Perhaps worst of all, he had tried to obstruct justice or stop the investigation by firing the special prosecutor and ordering his helpers to pay hush money to people who knew what had happened. The release of the tapes was the end of Nixon's power. The House of Representatives was ready to vote to impeach the president. On the night of August 7, 1974, the Republican leaders of the House and Senate met with Nixon in the Oval Office to tell him that the representatives in Congress would not stand by Nixon. They told him he would lose his job for sure. Knowing that he had no chance of staying on as president and that most Americans wanted him out, Nixon decided to resign or quit. On August 9th, he left the White House, the only president ever to quit. Nothing like this had ever happened before. The new president, Gerald Ford, was the first vice president chosen under the new 25th Amendment, which made a process for choosing a new vice president if a vice president died or quit. Nixon's first vice president, Spiro Agnew, had to quit after people learned he'd been taking bribes. Nixon had chosen Ford, a member of the House of Representatives from Michigan, to replace Agnew. Ford had been in government for a long time and was known for telling the truth. Ford was also the first vice president to become president after a president quit. Since he'd been picked by Nixon to take over as vice president, Ford was also the only president who was never elected either president or vice president. Ford understood that his most important job was to help people move on past the Watergate scandal. He said that our long national nightmare is over. Our great republic is a government of laws and not of men. People liked this idea, but were less happy when Ford gave Nixon a full pardon, which meant that Nixon would never have to go on trial or go to jail for anything he had done. Many Americans were angry. They wanted Nixon to have to pay for what he had done. In 1976, when Ford ran for president, his choice to pardon Nixon is one reason he lost. Nixon quitting and Ford's pardon did not make the Watergate scandal go away. Instead, it made Americans trust people in government even less. The events of Vietnam and the Pentagon Papers had already shown that politicians could not be trusted. For many, Watergate was proof of what they already thought. Today, the suffix "gate" added to a word has come to mean a scandal. News reporters have talked about Apple's Bend-gate and Antenna-gate, the NFL's Deflate-gate and Seat-gate, and many bad things politicians have done, call them Bridge-gate, Travel-gate, Emailgate, Nannygate, and Strippergate, to name just a few. Next, we'll talk about the story of the Iran hostage crisis. One of the saddest events in the late 1970s happened because of what America did in the Middle East during the Cold War, and created a problem we still have today. It also showed that no matter how strong our military is, there are some things they just can't do. It all happened in Iran. For years, the United States had helped the king, or Shah of Iran, because he was anti-communist. The Shah had become king during World War II and had worked hard in his 30 years to improve his country. He wanted to make Iran a modern place and gave rights to women. But Islamic religious leaders thought the Shah's ideas were against the Quran, the Muslim holy book. In 1979, cleric Ruhollah Khomeini led students in a fight against the Shah. They took control of the American embassy in Tehran, Iran's capital city, and they took 52 Americans at the embassy hostage. The Shah had gotten away and was in the United States. The revolutionaries said that America had to send him back to Iran in a trade for the hostages. President Carter said no, stating that the United States would not yield to blackmail. For 444 days, Americans watched on TV as the Iranians held the American hostages. The army tried to rescue the hostages. President Carter ordered Operation Eagle Claw, but it failed in April of 1980 when a helicopter and airplane crashed on their way into Iran. 8 Americans and 1 Iranian died. It was embarrassing for the American army and the president, who took responsibility for the crash. Because of the hostage crisis, the failure of Operation Eagle Claw, and the bad economy, Carter lost the 1980 election to Ronald Reagan. It was one of the most uneven elections in American history. Most people remember Carter as a bad president, but Carter has worked all the rest of his life to fight for human rights around the world. One last insult to Carter, the new Iranian government, controlled by the religious leaders, let the hostages go a few minutes after Ronald Reagan became president. Finally, let's look at what happened at a place called 3 Mile Island in 1979. 3 Mile Island is a nuclear power plant in Pennsylvania that uses nuclear energy to create electricity. On March 28, 1979, a valve in the cooling system got stuck open, which let a lot of nuclear reactor coolant get out. Normally, the coolant would keep the reactor from getting too hot. Without it, the reactor would melt and let out deadly radioactive material. The valve failure got worse because workers didn't notice what was happening. They didn't have enough training, and the lights in the control room were confusing. One worker actually thought there was too much coolant and turned off the automatic emergency system. By early the next morning, it was clear that things were going wrong. The reactor was way too hot. The station manager announced an emergency. The electric company that owned the plant, Metropolitan Edison, or MET-Ed, told the Pennsylvania Emergency Management Agency, which then told the state's governor, Richard Thorogood. The workers at the plant weren't sure what was happening, and so people who lived near the plant got confusing messages. Lieutenant Governor Scranton told the news reporters that there had been a small release of radiation, no increase in normal radiation levels, which didn't make sense. Another leader and MET-Ed both said that no radioactivity had gotten out. In fact, instruments had found that there was a release of radioactivity around the plant, but probably not enough to make people sick. State leaders were angry that MET-Ed was not telling them what was going on and was trying to make the accident look like it wasn't serious. They turned to the Nuclear Regulatory Agency, the federal agency that checks on nuclear power plants. The NRC sent people to 3 Mile Island, and NRC chairman Joseph Henry thought things were not too bad at first, but the NRC also had a hard time getting information, and they were not prepared to take care of an accident at a nuclear power plant. Their people didn't know who to talk to and didn't even have a plan about if they needed people to move away from the plant. In the end, the United States was lucky. The reactor at 3 Mile Island got too hot and melted, but not so much that radioactive material got out. But the 3 Mile Island accident showed again that leaders in business and technology, as well as in politics, made mistakes. People learn that they should not trust their leaders to tell them the truth or protect them. The 3 Mile Island accident was also a big change for nuclear power around the world. The accident did not stop people from using nuclear energy to make electricity, but it did stop people from building more nuclear power plants. At the time of the accident, electric companies were planning to build 129 new nuclear power plants, but of those, only 53 were built. Clearly, many anti-nuclear activists said scientists and business leaders were going to take shortcuts, and nuclear power was too dangerous to be used to make electricity. Around the world, people stopped building nuclear power plants after the deadly Chernobyl accident in the Soviet Union in 1986. Let's finish by reviewing the big ideas from today's lesson. The Pentagon Papers show that multiple presidents had lied about their real reasons for fighting the war in Vietnam, and Nixon's fight with the newspapers led to an important Supreme Court decision protecting the freedom of the press. President Nixon was forced to resign in 1974 when it became clear that he had tried to hide crimes committed by his supporters. The Watergate scandal, along with the Pentagon Papers, marked a change in America. After the early 1970s, many fewer Americans trust presidents and other powerful leaders. In 1979, revolutionaries in Iran took 52 Americans hostage. President Carter could not negotiate their release, and a military mission failed. And finally, the meltdown at the 3 Mile Island nuclear power plant showed Americans that its top scientists, engineers, and business leaders also made mistakes. Thank you very much. In our next and final lesson of this unit, we'll talk about globalization and how it's been both good and bad for America.